My mom's sister and her husband died when I was very little, and they left behind a son. He came to live with us for a little bit, but I don't really remember it. It must have only lasted for a few years or so, because he was gone by the time I was starting the third grade. I never thought about him much after that, and my mom and dad never brought him up. I don't know why, but I thought about him again a few years ago. Maybe the birth of my son brought him to mind. I never knew exactly what happened with his parents or where he went after he left my childhood home, so I got curious about where he ended up. After a few Google searches, I found the answer. He had been charged with multiple counts of murder, but had been found not guilty by reason of insanity in court. Since the age of 17, he had been locked up in a mental institution. I started writing him letters shortly after my discovery. The details of his murders were grisly to say the least, and I just couldn't understand how someone who had grown up in the same house as me, at least for some time, could have become such a monster. He was my cousin, my blood, and I couldn't comprehend how someone so closely related to me could have done something so brutal and inhuman. So I wrote him half a dozen letters over the course of 6 months asking questions about his childhood before he moved in with me, if he remembered what happened to his parents, and what made him do the things he did. I wasn't expecting a coherent response, but I never got any response at all. After the 6th letter, I assumed that the workers at the nut house were just throwing my letters away or something. That is, until a week ago. 2.5 years later, I finally received a letter back from my cousin. I opened it the night I found it in my mailbox, and this is what it said. Dear, I deeply apologize for my lack of response to your letters. I received them and read them, but all of the letters that I wrote back to you were confiscated and I assume destroyed. No doubt the staff here read them and found the contents too disturbing to reach you. But don't worry, cousin. I'll make sure that this one gets to you. Now, in regard to your many questions, I believe the following account should answer them all. The orderlies do not like it when I tell the story of what I experienced when I was living in the woods, as it horribly frightens the other patients. They say that it is my fault that my institutionalized fellows become hysterical when they hear the whistling of wind through the tree branches outside the facility. Even worse still is when the howling of coyotes reaches their ears. At the sound of it, they become utterly inconsolable and must be forcefully sedated. They wish that I would never speak of it, and have tried their best to keep my mouth shut, but I cannot help but tell of that horror in the woods. My family lived in a single-wide trailer in the Appalachian Mountains, on property that had belonged to my late grandfather, which was surrounded by thick forest on all sides. Keeping away from the hustle and bustle of society, and being in nature were important to my father and mother, your aunt and uncle, who took great pains to ensure that no one would suspect that anyone lived on that land unless they had the address. We had no neighbors for miles, and my father had to drive a great distance just to get his mail, but to them, it was worth it. The horror took place when I was 5 years old. Except for church on Sunday and occasional visits to relatives, my world was only my parents, the trailer, and the woods. I would play amongst the trees from dawn till dusk every day, running circles around them and climbing them as high as I could. I would chase squirrels, catch frogs, and swing sticks around to my heart's content. But as soon as the sun began to fade into the night, my mother and father would call me back home, and I always obeyed immediately. As much as I loved to play, I equally feared the dark. What danger there was in the woods at night was not clear to me as a child, but my parents made me understand that I should never be caught outside after sunset. They spoke in whispers about strange, unexplainable things in the woods that only came out at night. They gave no certain details about these things, but from their words I knew that if I were caught outside in the dark, I would surely die. It was a still and quiet autumn night when the horror came. I had been laid down to sleep by my mother after a long day of playing, and I was very tired. I was just about to cross the threshold of unconsciousness when the sound of wind stirred me awake. It was the familiar sound of rustling branches, which the woods often made when a gust of wind came through, but I was cognizant of a distinct difference in its quality. The sound felt extremely close, as if the twisted branches of the dying trees outside had somehow crept in and were underneath my bed. I cried out in fear, and my mother raced into the room to console me. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her it was the wind. The wind sounded wrong. She laughed as a mother does and rubbed my little cheeks. It was only the wind, she made me to understand, and the wind can't hurt you. She left the room again, and my head was once again nestled in my pillow. Then I heard the horribly close wind again, and on top of it the howling of coyotes, so close that I was sure that the ravenous beasts were in the room with me. I cried out again, shaking with fear, and my mother once again rushed to my aid. She asked what the issue was now, and I told her that it was the coyotes. The coyotes were too close. She laughed as a mother does and kissed my forehead. Coyotes sound very close even when they are far away, she made me to understand, and we won't let them hurt you. Once more she left the room, and I tried to sleep, but again came the terrible wind, the coyotes howling, and on top of that what sounded like a woman wailing at the top of her lungs. I was hysterical, screaming wildly as tears streamed down my face, and my mother came into my room once more. This time she heard the wind, she heard the coyotes, and she heard the awful wails. She trembled and made a feeble attempt to comfort me, but I could tell that finally she was as afraid as I was. She made a pitiful attempt to laugh as a mother does and squeezed my hand tightly. Foxes and bobcats sometimes make noises that sound like a woman screaming, her voice cracking as she tried to make me to understand. But we won't let them hurt you. She told me that she had to talk to my father about what was going on, but that she would be right back. She closed the door to my room, never to re-enter. The wind, the howling, and the wailing raged on, louder and louder, closer and closer, until I had to hold my hands over my ears to prevent my eardrums from bursting. After a few minutes, the sounds that haunted me suddenly ceased. I felt relief as I took my hands off of my ears, and I could hear nothing but the still silence yet again. A more horrible sound than anything that I had heard up to that point came from the other room then. I heard my mother and father cry out sharply, but their shrieks were swiftly terminated by a terrible crunching sound. I heard their bodies hit the floor with a wet thud. Then I heard nothing but a soft whistling of wind through tree branches, not as loud as before, but most certainly closer than the outside. I fearfully lowered myself from my bed and approached the door. I had not understood what I had heard. How could I have? But I knew that something was terribly wrong, that whatever I had to fear in the woods at night had ceased to stay in its domain and had come to us. I closed my eyes tightly and turned the doorknob, stepping into the living room blindly. When I opened my eyes, I saw the thing that will haunt me for the rest of my life. I saw the lifeless and horribly maimed bodies of my parents, yes, but the thing I saw standing over them was more supreme in its horror. Hunched above its victims, covered in blood, I beheld a humanoid creature about 8 or 10 feet in height. Its face was something of a cross between a man's and a deer, and it had large glistening white antlers protruding from its head. Its arms were like a man's but with sharp claws for hands, and its legs were deer-like with hooves for feet. Its body was incredibly taut and muscular, and its heavy breaths heaved within its bosom. The most striking and incomprehensible aspect of the hellish beast's visage was the skin that was covered by thin gray fur. It appeared to be composed of the same material as tree bark. Though I dared not to get close enough to touch its flesh, from all appearances, it seemed that it would have the very same texture as a tree. For what felt like ages, I just stood there, examining the hellspawn before me in abject terror. The sound of the whistling forest in the room fluctuated in volume, louder and quieter, again and again, yet still extremely close, and I realized that it corresponded with the beast's breathing. Somehow the noise of this creature's inhaling and exhaling had the exact same quality of that familiar sound. After what felt like an eternity of me staring at the thing, and it staring back, it opened its gaping maw and the sound of howling coyotes and wailing bobcats flowed from its throat. It should have been impossible for all of these sounds to be produced by that chimera, but I know what I saw and heard. I screamed in fear at what I feared might come next, and braced myself to face certain doom. However, my physical destruction was not to come that night, only the fracturing of my mind forever. The creature crept backwards out of the trailer, staring at me all the while, and retreated back into the woods. I don't remember what happened after that, the rest is a blur. I only remember Shu,